Hello, I'm Jason, and welcome to the show. So there's this photo that I've seen in the past, but that I can't for the life of me seem to find anywhere. I think it was taken around 2020 during the various BLM protests. I could be wrong on that, but the timing would fit. And it would make sense contextually because there were two clashing groups in this picture. So maybe I'm thinking Antifa and a sort of more right-wing contingent. The photographer must have been right in the thick of things, in that area in the middle where the police are trying to keep the different protesting factions apart and maintain order. The photo successfully captures the tension in the scene. There's flags and masks and a lot of angry faces painting the background. It all sort of implies a situation that is at the cusp of boiling over, which really, a lot of 2020 felt like that to me. In the center of the photo, the focus is on two men, each at the vanguard of their respective hordes. There's a tall, burly guy with an almost offensively smug look on his face, pointing the camera on his phone at a masked hooligan who's right up in his face in front of him and reciprocating the gesture. When I saw this picture for the first time, it really looked age-definingly iconic, sort of the modern equivalent of Richard the Lionheart crossing swords with one of Saladin's generals. This photo was the inspiration for this episode. And incidentally, if anyone out there knows what the photo is I'm talking about specifically, if they could send it to me, I would appreciate it. I could have the details wrong. It might not be from 2020. It might not be the BLM protest, but it was modern, and I'm describing the crux of the photo correctly. So with all that being said, it is my great pleasure to bring this episode to you today. I want to thank you for listening. It's a scene with which you're likely familiar. Two individuals engaged in heavy bickering somewhere out in public. The bickering escalates into an argument. The argument takes a turn for the worse. Insults are traded. Threats are leveled. And then, at the apex of the confrontation, when the two individuals in question inevitably fail to convince the other of the cogency of their respective points of view, out come the cell phones, cameras faced outward, and aimed at their opponent with the intensity of a Stalingrad sniper. Somehow, in this gutless, technology-flating wasteland of a culture we all live in, this gesture has become the ultimate trump card in any kind of confrontation between strangers. The equivalent of gunslingers in the Old West, whipping out their Colt 45s, but without the cathartic shootout that effectively ended the conversation one way or the other. In the Middle Ages, knights would have settled any disagreements with a sword fight, pontificating about honor all the while, no doubt, and supplementing their blows with witty verbal rejoinders. Even the aristocracy from the Renaissance era were always up for a good duel. They'd get decked out in their silk stockings and puffy shirts, and with a relatively cool head, saunter out to some prearranged locale at a specific time to settle things. There were even formal rules around it, a certain amount of paces for distance, turn to face each other at a specific count. You've all seen Hamilton, I'm sure. From the way it's been described, the whole thing sounded like it played out like a synchronized swimming routine. There was even a referee there to ensure that the premeditated murderers adhered to the dictates of etiquette. I suppose you could say we've made progress in this area. By all accounts, we aren't shooting up saloons and poker rooms at anywhere near the same rate as we have in the past. And I suppose this overall trend toward non-violence is a good thing. It's certainly hard to make the argument that we should move back to the days when disagreements were resolved with a showdown at high noon. Settling disputes without bloodshed is, of course, overall a step in the right direction. There is nothing more heartbreaking than a life lost to wholly avoidable violence. But still, this tawdry pantomime of thrusting your phone in the face of someone you're arguing with as if warding off a vampire with a crucifix seems to me to be emblematic of this ongoing trend in Western countries to sublimate our natural instincts, to shift responsibility away from the individual and into the rapacious tentacles of the state. In most Western nations, the US being the notable and notorious exception, you can't own a gun anymore except under near draconian restrictions. Physical assault can land you in prison for up to a decade. And if you do it while harboring hate in your heart, whatever the hell that means, your sentence could be even greater. In the United Kingdom, you can have non-crime strikes against your record if someone merely accuses you of doing something which they consider to be hateful. In Canada, you can't even say certain words unless you want to risk spending, quite literally, the rest of your life in prison. According to the Criminal Code of Canada, the mere act of raising your fist as if you're about to strike someone could land you in prison, as could any threat of that nature. Again, for up to a decade of your life. Because of all of this prescribed aversion to violence, the cameras on our phones have become our last line of defense. And for more than a few enthusiastic Karens out there, they've become an offensive weapon of choice. I think part of what I find so morally objectionable about this trend stems from childhood. Growing up, everyone knew that only the lowest form of cretin would snitch to the teacher. Except under egregious circumstances, nobody liked a tattletale. And yet, this is exactly what we have now. A coterie of tattletales, armed to the teeth with gigabytes of storage and an air of self-righteousness, using the camera on their phone as a sort of proxy for meting out punishment. What's worse, they're rewarded for their behavior. Rewarded with likes and retweets and slightly elevated social media clout. I'm not saying that there aren't situations that warrant the use of such action. There are some notable exceptions where a camera phone has been used to catch some unambiguously awful behavior. But I'd imagine that in a lot of these cases, the very act of pulling out the phone in the first place is the accelerant that transforms the situation from an argument into a fight. Not a physical fight, obviously, but it's the thing that shuts down the conversation, the line in the sand that shifts the dynamic and dehumanizes the interaction. Any notion of listening to what the other is saying or making amends or reaching a common ground has just gone out the window. The two parties in question are now engaged in a hateful standoff with each other. Cameras running, words slung out strategically with the intention to provoke the other into saying something or doing something horrible so they can capture it on video. And again, I don't know precisely what it is about this theoretical de-escalation that rubs me the wrong way. Once the cameras are rolling, the chances of any actual violence breaking out is significantly reduced. This is a good thing, right? Very civilized. This is what we'd been advancing toward even before the iPhone 3G came out. What I'd like to do here today is investigate why this behavior has evolved, what it means in the context of social relationships and personal development, and why this particular brand of passive-aggressive brinksmanship just feels so wrong to me. I've thankfully been in only a few situations in my adult life where a disagreement between myself and someone else has flared up to this point, to the point of almost becoming physical. It's intense. Your blood is boiling, your heart rate is accelerated. All the prehistoric parts of your brain are lighting up like firecrackers. And yes, it can be scary. Not just because you could get hurt, but you're shifting the social paradigm when you commit to an open argument. And it takes some effort to break through that membrane separating the world where we engage in polite social discourse to that other world where we're openly confronting someone. Maybe it's just people pleasers like me that find this difficult to do, but once that line has been crossed, both parties generally recognize it and the whole scene becomes much more feral. And it's an unusual situation. It dislodges us from our daily reality. But the truth of the matter is that once the encounter is over, I've always felt good about myself afterwards. Any pent-up stress is gone, that's for sure. I feel like I'm living more vividly during these rare occasions, experiencing life in a way that it was, in a way, meant to be experienced. It feels primal, even natural. Like that time wasn't wasted, no matter what else you could say about it. And once again, I'm truly not advocating for violence here. I definitely don't want to be involved in a physical confrontation. But what most people don't realize is that despite all the pomp and posturing, almost no one else wants to fight either. They're almost always equally relieved when a compromise is found, or when the argument dies down and everybody storms off in their own direction. And yet, the looming threat of the violence, the action of what is effectively two apex predators facing off against one another, forces a focus on each person involved. It forces an examination of one's own behavior. And after the standoff, when the adrenaline is worn down, one can safely piece together why events unfolded the way that they did. How did the argument evolve? Did I start it? Was I being unreasonable? Should I not have said that thing that I said? We might not even admit to ourselves how informative such events are, but they can help in molding how we behave in society. I think it probably teaches more tolerance of certain behaviors, calluses our emotional fortitude, depending on how it all went down. It can spark a realization that words have consequences and that life can be unpredictable, so you better be certain that your words and actions are genuinely in line with your principles. I think these kinds of confrontations have played a part in our natural evolution, and I believe they've served some purpose. Maybe they've acted as a vital protective measure or played a part in shaping one's character, fortifying them with experience under duress so that when there is a much graver threat, that person isn't completely like a fish out of water. There's this social media influencer, and God, how I hate that term. I don't know if he's even technically an influencer. I don't know what constitutes being an influencer, but he's this guy on social media who just uploads videos and makes a ton of money out of it. Jack Doherty is his name. And if you don't know who he is, congratulations, you're living a healthy life. He basically just does dumb shit all day and gets a ton of views on YouTube or Twitch or whatever platform he's using now. One of his hilarious stunts that he does is that he walks around and invades people's personal spaces just trying to instigate a fight with them. And he's this tiny, weaselly guy, so like a lot of the people he's doing this to immediately start to engage with him. But then as soon as they do, his bodyguard steps in between the two of them, and he's big enough and intimidating enough to send the other person just cursing under their breath and like walking away from the kind of contrived fight. And he just basically does stuff like this, and he gets a lot of likes and a lot of money from doing this kind of thing. And sadly, he isn't the only one doing this. I've seen videos where people record themselves running up into people's faces at random and asking them if they want to die. Just kind of running up to someone walking into a store or walking down the street and just asking them repeatedly whether they want to die. You can imagine how unsettling that would be. There's others where people record themselves cutting a cable on some headphones of someone who is just sitting at a coffee shop trying to enjoy their existence, and suddenly the cables on their headphones have been cut and they can't use their headphones anymore. I mean, obviously it's incredible to me that people post this stuff online. It's just such a stark indictment of the kind of society we're living in right now. But my point is that there's no consequences for this type of behavior. It's generally too minor for the police to be involved, and if anyone responded in a physical way, they could be brought up on charges, so they're unlikely to do that. I'd probably even feel different about these types of antics if these people were just legitimately doing this for the lulz. But their motivations aren't even that pure. They're doing it because they know they'll get views and likes and engagement, even if the engagement is negative. What do they care? They can still monetize their brand and make an incredible living off of it. That Jack Doherty guy is estimated to be worth around $60 million. He's 21. He recently totaled his $200,000 car live streaming and texting while driving. And this thing was all caught on video, of course, because he was live streaming it. And it alone sums up to me everything you need to know about this type of person. It's worth checking out, though you may need some anti-nausea medication when you see his reaction. Anyway, I digress. The extraordinary negative effects of having our mobile phones so lecherously tethered to us is well documented. There is a ton of literature now that shows how addiction to social media apps, especially among teenagers, has impacted our physiology, our moods, and our behavior. There was a popular Netflix documentary on it, which I think was pretty revealing for a lot of people. It made them question how they engage with these platforms. But it isn't just social media. The devices themselves augment and amplify these harmful effects. These surrogate crack pipes with their titanium charms and come-hither haptics have been specifically and irresistibly designed as a beguiling complement to the applications they host. Which, of course, makes sense. It just means the engineers are good at what they do. But we as consumers have to recognize just how intimately involved with our phones we've become. That they're more than just an ultra-convenient access layer for a bunch of pernicious social media applications. They also damage our sleep cycles, what with all the preternatural light that they emanate. The blue light from phones suppresses melatonin production, triggering insomnia, which in turn makes us more tired throughout the day, decreasing our brain functioning, etc. Most people have their phones right on the bedside next to them, pulsing out whatever cocktail of radio waves we have it set up for. Wi-Fi, 5G, Bluetooth. All non-ionizing radiation to be sure, but is everyone really so comfortable nestling up with these things at night when there's been no real long-term studies on the physical effects of cell phone use? In the daytime, they keep our attention persistently diverted with the alluring siren call of their notifications. A lot of people, myself included, mute these now, but I'll still have the banners pop up, and now I just find myself listening for that little haptic buzz all day. Even if we decide to turn off the banners, like we know it's there, we know things are happening on it, and it's just so easy to check. It's turning us all into ADHD-riddled attention apnea zombies who find it almost unbearable to listen to someone tell a story that lasts more than 30 seconds. Even writing this thing, I've had to hide my phone under a blanket, and I'm checking it after every paragraph as a kind of reward mechanism. And I wouldn't even consider myself someone who's glued to their phone. I've seen much worse, I assure you. The very fact that so much of our lives flow through our phones now, in some way or another, means it's easy to justify having it by our side throughout the day and night. Want to listen to music? Open up that Spotify app. Have 30 minutes to kill in a doctor's office? Pop open Netflix or Reddit or YouTube. Do you want to think for more than 2 seconds to recall what the capital of Nigeria is? Just open up Google. Of course, you need it by your bed so the alarm app will wake you up in the morning. Need to have it on the table during a meeting just in case something urgent happens. Because our phones are now so integral to our lives, we find ourselves grabbing them so constantly that it really isn't hard to imagine the idea that these things will soon be melded into us as another appendage, which is literally what's going to happen, by the way, and most people will be happy to have it. Not everyone, and not always, but more and more on average. But there's a trade-off here, right? It's not all bad, or we wouldn't love them so much. Certainly there's some benefit to having this versatile companion in our lives. I think most people would consider the camera on our phone as one of the few overall beneficial applications, but I'm actually here to shit all over that idea. My brothers and I recently did up a video for my mom whereby we compiled a ton of old photographs and set it to some Beatles music as a kind of retrospective on her life, through pictures. It was quite a lovely thing, and she was appropriately touched. Something really jumped out at me while doing this, though. I have so few photos from when I was young. Fortunately, someone was taking a few pictures of the family itself during those times, but I have so many old friends that I don't have any photos of, or at least not the two of us together. I dated a girl for 2 years in university, and I don't have a single photo of her. And she was a huge part of my life back then. Meanwhile, I have like 20,000 pictures of the dogs I have now, in all kinds of poses and situations. But as adorable as they are, the pictures themselves don't really change much in terms of context. It's just like, here is the one of her with her sunglasses on. Here she is in her bed. Here she is with her head tilting slightly to the left. Usually, when inspiration strikes, I'll snap about 5 to 10 pictures of my dog in quick succession so I can grab the best one of the bunch. But oftentimes, I'll never even go back to look at them, and so I just keep accumulating more and more pictures, each one somewhat reducing the value of all the other ones in terms of supply and demand theory. I don't know. There's just a passivity to how we live our lives now. With all this technological abundance, things just don't seem to have the same value anymore. In the same way we absentmindedly like or share a flurry of Instagram posts, we're taking pictures and recording events with that same listless, apathetic luster. You'll see this at concerts or birthdays, or even sunsets on the beach. We're all now experiencing life through this lens as opposed to experiencing it directly. For some reason, we feel compelled to record events rather than live them. I don't even really know why. I don't even know if there's a consistent reason for this. I can examine my own behavior. I was at a Johnny Marr concert recently, and I've never seen him play live before, and he's kind of iconic to me. I've been a massive Smiths fan for most of my life, and I've seen Morrissey perform a bunch of times, but never Johnny. And while there, I found myself sort of joining the crowd and just mindlessly thrusting my phone up above the throngs of people so I could nab pictures, random pictures, and short clips of video. Just like haphazardly. It wasn't framed well, the angle was off, there were people's arms all over the place. I was basically just doing it to do it. And I'll never go back to watch that. Why would I? It's a shadow of the original experience. So instead of just immersing myself and living in the moment at the time, I was trying to somehow capture this fleeting spasm of life and lock it up in a cage along with my dog pictures and photos of random food dishes that I felt compelled at some point to document for posterity. Our phone cameras dehumanize us in other, more obvious ways as well. There seems always to be at least one unscrupulous jackanape filming whenever there's something unfortunate happening. Really bad car accident, schizophrenic talking to himself in the subway, suicide attempt. All over social media, you can see situations where something really heartbreaking is happening. And there always seems to be someone who decided that the rest of the world needed to see it. Of course, a variation of the anthropic principle plays a part here, since we naturally would only see videos of these types were someone to be recording them. But I've seen this happen in person too. It's ubiquitous, this phenomenon. It's hard not to blame technology for where we find ourselves, though we are all culpable participants. This synergistic relationship that has developed between us, our phones, and social media applications is warping how we interact with each other and where we choose to focus our energy. It is incorrectly defining who we are and what we want, and we're letting it happen. When we interact with social media, liking or sharing or even viewing certain videos will tell the algorithms more about what we want to see. It will prey upon our natural biases and predilections in a way that will guide us toward the most extreme, the most sensationalistic, and the most simplistic notions, because fundamentally, that is what we all want. There is that passivity. It's easy, it's fun, it's tantalizing. The algorithms are masters at tapping into all those low-level pleasure centers. When we're scrolling Instagram or TikTok or X, we aren't looking to be informed, whatever we might tell ourselves. We're looking to be titillated and feel good about ourselves, dopamine-craving whores that we are. Perhaps it's because they're fundamentally binary at their core that the algorithms tend to drift toward dichotomies. This lack of moral complexity, this idea of a black and white world manifesting in innumerable contexts, seems to be what it wants to give us. And it wants this because, as much as we might deny it to ourselves, this is ultimately what we want too. We want reality TV, we want gossip, we want the horror and the Madonna, we want heroes and villains, good and evil. We want anything to distract us from the fact that we'll all be dead one day. I honestly think that that's probably what it all boils down to. A while back, there were memes that circulated showing dolled-up women at the gym thrusting themselves in front of men, while simultaneously crying that they were being objectified. This was sort of the male response to a TikTok trend where women would surreptitiously record men ogling them while they worked out, and then post the outrage online. Now, there were undoubtedly some miserable wretches out there who were glaring at women so obviously and lasciviously that the women felt they needed to strike back against this despicable behavior, and this was a good way to do it. But after those first clips got popular, some other, more disingenuous videos began to appear, which had been clipped together to make it seem as though a woman was being objectified, when really the man was just kind of doing their own thing at the gym, and maybe glanced in the woman's direction a few times in the course of it. It was videos of this sort that inspired the aforementioned memes. And so we have two rather ugly behaviors pumped out into social media. Videos where a man is legitimately leering at a woman while she exercises, and videos where the action is more ambiguous, and it isn't upon closer examination where one concludes that this is more or less a hatchet job, made to appear as though it's something it's not. These messages are the distorted amplifications of events that did actually happen, but they're making the behaviors seem far more prevalent than they actually are. And since they're highlighting the extremes of an issue, they're pumped full of that algorithmic octane saturating our social media feeds and landing somewhere in the nether regions between our conscious and unconscious mind. Both narratives are now trending, inundating the various social media silos on TikTok, Reddit, 4chan, and others with two extreme but opposing narratives. Number one, in this case, any man who so much as glances at a woman in the gym should be drawn and quartered. Number two, any woman posting this kind of video is either an attention-seeking whore or a rabid postmodern feminist bent on the subjugation of the male species. As a consumer of this media, these are the options presented to you. Not that you'll have a conscious choice on this particular matter. The algos will just feed you whichever bias it is determined would resonate more with you based on what you like to watch. Both of these extreme viewpoints are perpetuated by subsequent videos that reinforce this bias, and they're further calcified by comments on the various videos, with the most ideologically orthodox comments generally rising to the top. There is a weird, if diabolically beautiful, symbiosis happening here between algorithms and the humans engaged with the content. The algos are capturing and exploiting a spectrum of psychological vulnerabilities, our need to be a part of a tribe, our tendency towards sensationalism, our preference for opinions that agree with our own, among others. It isn't that we're being told what to think necessarily. It's just that the options we're given are simplistic, sensationalistic, and utterly bereft of nuance. Because there is, of course, a middle ground that was completely lost in this particular controversy, but which anyone with an ounce of sense would probably agree upon. Leering at a woman repeatedly and constantly to the point where they feel uncomfortable is wrong. Merely glancing in their direction a few times in the course of one's workout is not. Of course, this perspective isn't very interesting to people, mostly because it just represents the run-of-the-mill, reasonable way that people already think. And any responses propagating this message aren't likely to receive that same algorithmic elixir. If you want to be part of the conversation on these platforms, you need to make your message loud and simple. Similarly, posting a video which shows a police officer bullying someone they've pulled over or flagrantly disregarding the law is a positive corrective measure. On the other hand, posting a video of an officer who is doing everything they can to resolve a situation lawfully and with respect, but who is constantly baited by the subject until the officer raises their voice or uses harsh language, is a negative. These videos, too, fluff up our individual biases, and the social media algorithms duly inundate our feeds with whichever side of this distinct, polarized viewpoint they think that we're most likely to gravitate toward. Again, the middle ground has no voice here. It's the extremes that attract. It's the extremes that get the clicks. Also, there probably isn't a whole lot of middle ground source material to go on. Not many people are uploading videos of a mutually respectful administration of a speeding ticket. Of course, the middle ground does exist logically in our minds, but because these videos are so numerous and so consistently fed into our stream, and hence into our consciousness, it's as if there are only two polarized perspectives. After enough time, our minds find it difficult to resist this. Most of us will feel ourselves nudged toward one extreme or another. You can sometimes see in the public people trying to foray into this middle ground, which is essentially like wandering into no man's land. Remember that Matt Damon interview with ABC News where he claimed that there was a spectrum of sexual assault? He basically said that there was a big difference between a slap on the ass and rape, which is, of course, obvious. Nonetheless, despite the disclaimers he gave and the fact that he condemned all the behavior on this spectrum in any case, he was still castigated in the media and even by some of his colleagues for being tone deaf. Like, there is clearly a distinction in things here. There is clearly a grade of sexual assault. Admitting this doesn't mean that the lesser events are therefore permissible. But it does mean that one is more acceptable than the other. One is more egregious than the other. It's okay to have scale here and admitting that there are gradations. Like, I doubt that there are too many women out there who have post-traumatic stress disorder because of that pinch on the ass they got at the bar that time. It's funny in that interview because you can tell from his body language and how he's wading into this that he knows that even though this is a completely reasonable statement he's about to make, that he needs to choose his words carefully, simply due to the incendiary nature of the subject and the times we live in. Of course, it didn't really matter how carefully he treaded. His crime was daring to have an opinion on the subject at all. It's unfortunate that we're living in a society where we need to delve into this granular level of human behavior on topics which should otherwise be perfectly obvious to any reasonable person. But social media and its Borg-like contingents of rabble-rousers care nothing for context or ambiguity. There are no grays in this milieu. Only interchangeable solids of black and white. It doesn't matter to these people that it would be perfectly natural for a man to glance toward an attractive woman a few times at the gym. Even were such an action deliberate, we're literally talking about tens of thousands of years of evolution at play here. And it doesn't matter to them that a police officer may raise his voice when addressing someone who is going out of their way to be a problem, since that officer is also a human being, subject to all our emotions and psychological limits. The good news is, I think most of us fundamentally understand this. I believe that most people have a fairly similar moral compass. They are what we would have traditionally called good people. But it's becoming increasingly irrelevant what the silent majority want or believe, as the extremes are now capturing the attention, and even guiding policy. The political class and the legislation they're developing are mere reflections of what the loudest voices are saying. If one side is collectively shrieking about racism and colonialism and the nebulousness of one's biological sex, and the other side is ranting about foreign isolationism, election fraud, and Pizzagate, you're eventually going to have political candidates emerge whose platforms largely target these talking points, whether explicitly or implicitly. They'll pander to this crowd, and in so doing, perpetuate the idea that there are two opposite groups of people in the country with polar opposite views, and not just a massive middle ground where most people agree with most things. While the systems in Western countries have been set up in such a way that there are inherent checks and balances to keep a lid on some of the more egregious notions, there is still a gradual drift away from issues of legitimate concern because the silent majority are too busy working their jobs, living their lives, and paying their taxes to inject themselves into all this insanity. And so they're pulled against their will toward the extremes that are being shouted by those loudest voices. It's hard to be an honest broker in 2024. The rewards and incentives have fallen by the wayside. These days we teach that words are violence and that morality is subjective. We teach people, explicitly or otherwise, that a 10-second clip of someone's behavior encapsulates everything you need to know about that person, and that any past mistakes are indelible scars upon one's soul for which they should forever pay reparations. All of the beautiful and variegated complexities of human nature have been reduced down to one-dimensional templates, and our judgment of others has become fiercely binary. There's been a distinct shift toward passivity in our society, and it isn't hard to see why. With new laws harshly criminalizing hate speech and with mainstream rhetoric propagating the idea that white supremacy is the number one problem facing America today, it's easy to see why more and more people are clamming up and looking the other way. Major companies like Target and Walmart are, maybe not routinely, but very often ransacked by shoplifters who brazenly liberate goods from their stores in full view of the security guards, who, in turn, don't dare interfere lest they be caught on camera engaging in behavior that will be pounced upon by the herd. Time and time again, we see stories of individuals who have said something or done something that require a longer, more serious investigation into why they did what they did or said what they said. Whether the person in question was acting in good faith or not is often lost in the knee-jerk avalanche of condemnations that follow a viral video clip. If you're on the wrong side of a narrative and you're caught on camera, the bottom feeders that trawl the news wires for sensationalistic fodder will pluck you out of context, shellac your story with easily digestible assumptions, and present you to their audience with extreme prejudice, where you'll be judged, sentenced, and socially executed before the truth even has a chance to come out. And so the prudent strategy, the survival strategy, is to keep your mouth shut and your head down. We used to all be on the same page, more or less, as to what was considered morally right. The wholesale slaughter of women and children, for example, was previously frowned upon by pretty much everyone. In October of last year, however, we saw that wide swaths of the population were quite able to countenance such a thing, at least so long as they're Jewish. While it's certainly shocking to watch throngs of Westerners shout murderous epithets in college protests with the same casual insouciance as if they were chanting, "Make love, not war," it wasn't hard to predict that that's where we'd end up, given the reckless indulgence we've seen to radical ideas since the mid-2010s. What was harder to predict, and what is clearly emblematic of this massive shift toward trepidation and passivity, is a general lack of response to overt anti-Semitism by many college administrators, and also the relative lack of indignation coming from mainstream America. We're all afraid now. We all cower before the almighty iPhone and its cloud-based permanent record. And who can blame us? Who would want to risk their own freedom when ideas of right and wrong have become so thoroughly ambiguous? When anything you say or do could be hacked up and spewed out into a vicious media landscape where overly simplified political narratives poison the common well we all draw upon? Who would trust in such a system? Deep down, I think we all know this template is wrong, that this deference to the extremes, to the morally weak and the intellectually lazy, does not make for a stronger, friendlier, more well-adjusted society. On some level, we see it for what it is, a blistering affront to humanity as a whole, to our instincts and inclinations. We humans come with a whole host of ideals built into us. We want love, adventure, freedom. We want challenges to overcome and causes to fight for. It's fused into our bones and it's coursing through our veins. It fuels those same actions that otherwise present as illogical or suboptimal if the only goal is survival. And yet these are the things that propel us forward as a society, that send us up into space against all odds, racing out onto the battlefield under a barrage of artillery and gunfire only to gain an inch of ground. We're a species that is well aware of its own mortality and yet keeps calm and carries on regardless. We were not born to be meek, to stand down and look the other way when confronted with decisions that trigger ideas of right and wrong. The logic part of our brain may know what the new rules are, insofar as it can make sense of their various incongruencies and contradictions, And it knows that it should follow these rules in order to safely navigate this chaotic landscape. But the spirit rejects these notions. It rails against all the caustic ideas permeating mainstream culture, which seem to fulminate division. We can't quite reconcile this dissonance between our survival instincts and our humanity, and the best we can do is angrily thrust a phone in the face of someone else because that is the limit of what is now socially acceptable in human discord. We need to be very careful with where we are right now. It's quite possible that the physical and verbal confrontations we've had in the past were part of some evolutionary pressure valve that vented periodically to avoid a catastrophic buildup. Or perhaps they were simply a corrective measure, a non-official method of keeping people aligned with the unspoken rules we all commonly agreed upon. I don't know what effect shoving our cell phone cameras into each other's faces is having on us as a culture, but it doesn't feel good or natural. I'm concerned that this is just driving the beast inside us all deep underground, into a kind of gestational hibernation. And I fear that when it emerges, it isn't going to be for some light dust-up in the parking lot, but rather something deep, dark, and abhorrently violent. The First World War was a tragic affair. Over 40 million people were either killed or wounded. By all accounts, life in the trenches was unrelentingly brutal. A soldier's day-to-day consisted of ducking bullets, dodging mortar shells, fending off increasingly audacious rats, and every now and then scurrying out of the trench for a suicidal charge toward a thoroughly fortified, well-prepared enemy. And yet, even within this decidedly macabre milieu, the German and French forces still honored a brief ceasefire around Christmas 1914, when soldiers all across the Western Front emerged from their trenches to come together and share drinks, smokes, and merriment with the other side. I think some people see in this event a sort of madness, a perversion of the human condition that involves a kind of psychopathic split in our behaviors, whereby we can play cards with a new friend one day, but then go right back to the business of killing them the next. But I love this story. I've always found it profoundly uplifting. To me, it wonderfully encapsulates the paradoxical nature of the human condition. We have a job to do, bills to pay, political egos to glorify. But ultimately, the camaraderie we have with our fellow human on an individual level trumps all that. If given the opportunity, we'll look for any excuse to bond with one another, to break bread, and to empathize. We want to like people. I think that old Reagan quote about how quickly we'd all pull together as a species in the face of an alien threat is spot on. If we strip away the abstractions and the distortions that come from technological or ideological structures placed between us, we're quick to identify the best and worst aspects of ourselves in each other. And though we may disagree on some subjects, it really is a case of us versus the system, rather than us versus each other. We truly are all in this together. Again, I want to thank you all for listening today. Please feel free to leave a comment to us on Spotify or whatever podcast app you're using. If you enjoyed this show, please subscribe and share with your friends. All of your support is appreciated and truly treasured. Thank you and goodbye.